Hi there, my name is Audrey and welcome to my studio. Over the holiday season, I was fortunate to receive a few gift cards.
Yay!
And I already had a wish list of art supplies, so gift cards plus wish list. So join me as I open up my new set of gouache paints and test them out. Let's see what happens. A quick story about my gouache experience. I actually did attempt to paint with gouache a few years ago, but I made a couple of mistakes. Number one, I hardly did any research before purchasing. I have a tendency to buy things sometimes on impulse, and it was definitely a mistake in this situation. I just happened to be at the art supply store, I saw the gouache, and I just bought it. Number two, I bought a really cheap brand because of my first mistake of not doing any research. I'm not saying that buying the most expensive brand is always the best, but once you do some research, you'll have a better idea of what might be the best fit for you. My last and probably biggest mistake was that I had squeezed the paint into a folding palette. And while gouache can be reactivated, it won't be the same consistency as before. I had noticed that the paint dried so much, it cracked, and I found myself using my brush a bit too harshly in order to reanimate the paint again. So what was the result of this brief gouache experience? Well, the paints didn't produce good results. They got super cakey, super dry, like prunes in the palette. And the paint on the paper also dried chalky because it was of less quality. So in the end, I gave up, I was frustrated, and I just kept going with my watercolors, which was okay, until today. So next time, do your research. Now, since I had the gift card, I thought I'd get gouache that was of a much higher quality. And I had heard great things about the Holbein Gouache for years. So that's what I got. I also got Holbein's acrylic gouache, so look out for that video in the future. Now, while I am experienced with watercolors, I know gouache requires a slightly different process. So if I make any huge mistakes here, please go easy on me. It's sort of my first time trying to use them properly. Let's talk briefly about what makes gouache similar and different from watercolors, and we'll get a little scientific. So gouache and watercolors are similar in that they're both water-based paints. That means that they can be re-wetted and manipulated. So if you make a mistake, you can actually wet it and scrub it off. Now for the main difference. Watercolor is transparent and gouache is opaque. Now the transparency of watercolors is one of the reasons I love it so much. You can water it down to the point where it's basically see-through, but still see a slight tint of color. And there's also a luminosity to watercolor paintings. You can also layer colors on top of each other and still see the underpainting. The reason for this transparency is because watercolors have smaller, finer pigment particles, which allows more light to shine through it and onto the paper and then bounce back the light into your eyes that makes the color transparent. In gouache, the same pigment particles are just larger. So there's less room for the light to shine through and thus making the color opaque. And that's why gouache paintings have a flat and matte look to them. You can water down gouache to make it more transparent, but then you'd sort of be defeating the purpose of using gouache, which is to take advantage of its opacity. But feel free to use it however you like. And so because of this, some artists use both gouache and watercolors to create really vibrant paintings. Usually watercolors is used first, and then gouache applied on top. And I think I'm excited to kind of experiment and see how I can use both simultaneously too. Okay, you've heard me ramble on for a bit. Let's get into opening the box and painting something together. Let's get started. Okay, so this is the acrylic gouache that I was talking about. And I'll open this and test them out in a different video, but I just wanted to show you that I do have it and I'm really excited about it. But this is what we're going to be working with today. Okay, first let me just say that I love packaging I love to admire it. I like just being inspired by it. And so first of all, I really like just the way that this looks. And I like that even right here, I don't know if you can read this, but it kind of explains what kind of gouache paint you own. So let me just read it for you real quick because it's actually it's cool. So it says, Holbein Artist Gouache is a high quality opaque watercolor paint for artists, designers, illustrators, and students, made from the finest pigments selected for high color density, saturation, and light fastness. Holbein Artist Gouache does not contain whitening agents and will always deliver consistent, reliable results without milking out, darkening, or muddiness. Holbein's dedication and commitment to manufacturing excellence ensures vibrant, brilliant colors and consistent results with every tube produced. So yeah, just reading that just makes you feel like, wow, I've got a really nice quality set of paints in my hand. So yeah, I'm excited. Okay, so I just got the 12 color set because if there's anything I learned from watercolors, it's that you don't need all 100 colors in your crayon box. Right? Just having the basics is a really good place to start. So yeah, so that's why I got the 12, but then I also got a huge tube of the white. Yeah, this is what, 60 milliliters, and this is 15 milliliters. So I got 4 times as much in the white because I can imagine myself mixing the white into a lot of my colors. And as this description just said, it said that it doesn't have whitening agents. So that's great because then the colors are going to be super vibrant. But what if I want to, lighten a color, but I don't want to water it down, right? Then I can use this permanent white, which I read is a good option for mixing into your colored paints. I think it's different than the one that comes with the palette. Yeah, well, it says the same permanent white, but it has a different number. All right, so here we are. We've got all 12 colors. Let me just pick up one of them and just show you up close. So looking closely at this tube, it's interesting because on this label, it actually says gouache will dry out, crack, and may fall from the palette. So that's another reason for you not to squeeze them onto one of those folding palettes because there's no point. Somewhere on the tube, they should also tell you the pigment name. And so that's written right here under the barcode. And this one is PR170. I like that it has the name very clearly on here. It kind of gives you an idea of what the color is going to be. I am curious to see how closely it is to the actual, color on the label. So, yeah. Okay, so since it is recommended not to use a folding palette, I'm actually going to use these plastic palettes, and I have a ton of these because I use them for my in-person watercolor workshops, but due to COVID, I'm not able to host in-person workshops. So I do have like 30 of these just lying around, and I reuse these because they're easily, you can easily clean them. What I did do to prep these though, before I use them in a workshop is I actually, because they're plastic and have a coating to them, I actually went over it with some steel wool to kind of roughen up the surface. And that way, when I paint on top of it and there's water, the roughness of the surface will actually make the paint stay in place. So if you don't do that, what you'll notice is that your paint will kind of start to bead up, and then it might just roll around all over the place. But helping to roughen it up just kind of makes the paint stay where it is. So these are already prepped and ready to go. So I have some cold pressed watercolor paper with me, and I'll be using mostly a round 6 and a round size 4 brushes. I just noticed that on my round 4, some of the words are starting to fade. That's kind of sad. All right, let's get started with testing out these colors. Now, I have just a large watercolor paper here, and I wanted just to allow myself a lot of space And you might be wondering what this is down here. I actually didn't have black cardstock. I don't know why I don't, but I have craft paper. So I thought I would just, at least put that there so that the white can show up. All right, so here we go. This is always like the hardest part, right? Like busting into something new. You're like, I just want to look at it and never actually use it. Anyone else feel like that? Maybe it's just me. Oh my gosh, it's so pretty. All right, so here we go with the, oh my gosh, it's already kind of squeezing out because that's what it likes to do. Let's put the cap back on before it decides to escape. All right, well, I'm just gonna go all the way around. That way I don't forget what is where. And I'm barely even squeezing the tube. It's kind of already, like maybe it's already like pressurized in there. So the paint is already squeezing itself out almost. And I'm only doing a very, very small amount. And that's how you know that, these tube paints will actually go a long way, because what I squeeze out today will probably actually last me a good long while. Now, the only reason why I might, I need to squeeze this one out a little bit. Now, the only reason why I might, put down new fresh paint is because maybe I mixed it up, maybe it got contaminated, something like that, or maybe I just need a fresh color. But otherwise, I think I'll probably do some more like color studies with these. And look, I barely squeeze these paints, seriously. But so far, just straight out of the tube, yeah, they're already so pretty. Now, because these paints are so fresh out of the tube, you might not have to add all that much water to them. And that's actually the tricky part about gouache, right? In watercolors, you actually want to add water, not just for the opacity, but in order just to be able to work with them easily. But with gouache, in order to maintain its opaqueness, you actually don't want to add too much water. So I think that's another reason why you want to use them fresh out of the paint or fresh out of the tube. All right, let's get to swatching these colors. I'm gonna use a size 6 brush and put it in my water jar and blot my brush just a little, because I don't want it to be bone dry, but I want it to be, just semi-dry. All right, let's start out with the carmine. Just working my brush in there. It's picking it up really nicely. And it's just being activated just with the water that's already on my brush. And I'm just gonna paint like a 1-inch square. All right, so because I'm using cold pressed paper, you see like a little bit of streakiness happening, and that's due to a couple of things, right? First of all, the paint is really thick, but then it also means that my brush is really dry. So if that's the case, if you're okay, I can add just a little bit of water to my brush just by dipping it very briefly in there. And it's not gonna water down my color all that much, but it'll help the color to go on my paper a little bit more smoothly. All right, just for a test, I kind of want to see what it looks like when it's a little bit watered down. So I'm going to swish around in my water cup and then paint another square. I just want to see what kind of opacity or how I can play around with the opacity and how it actually looks when it dries. Go on to the next color, the flame red. And again, I'm just going to dip my brush in the water cup just slightly, just to add a little bit more water onto my brush, not necessarily watering down the color. Now, some gouache artists, I think, really like this texture, and so they like to work with cold pressed paper, and they like the streaky, texture to their paintings. And to each his own, right? You don't have to like it. It's just one of the things that will happen if you have not a lot of water on your paint and you're working with textured paper. So I'm going to wash it out just a little bit and then see what it looks like when it's watered down. Yeah, I mean, you still get very, very pretty colors when it's watered down. Now, because with gouache, you can layer colors on top of each other and you won't necessarily see the underpainting. So when you do that, you do want to make sure that your paint is completely dry, like bone dry. Because it is water-based, so if you go in there with a second layer that's too wet, then you're actually going to reactivate the underpainting, and then you're going to get this weird, muddied, mixed-up color. So if you want to avoid that, make sure that you use thicker paint, right? A drier brush, thicker paint, and you have to make sure that your underpainting or your first layers are completely dry. Now, if you find that your paint has dried, I think it is okay to go in there with, a spray bottle or with a little pipette of water just to, wet your paints again. Just make sure not to add too much. All right, so here's the permanent yellow deep. Oh, this is such a pretty color. It's like a nice marigold color. I could see myself using this color a lot. Again, yeah, I do love just the opacity of it. Sometimes when I paint with watercolor, sometimes I wish that it was more opaque, and so that's why, like I said earlier, I am excited to kind of play around with how I can use watercolors and gouache simultaneously. That's just pretty exciting. On to lemon yellow. I mean, I love mixing colors with lemon yellow as well. I love that it's, it's so light, but yet it's so vibrant. I don't know how to quite describe it. And it's a great yellow to mix with like oranges to get like a coral type kind of color, or if you want really, bright greens, then this is a color you want to mix with. And look how transparent that looks just by adding some water to it. Wow. Okay, gonna keep trucking on onto the permanent green light. I'm gonna take a quick break because I just want to observe the watered down gouache that I painted, and I'm noticing that they actually dried a little bit darker than I anticipated. And I also like that you know, sometimes when the paint kind of like pools when the water is, or when the paint is too wet, and all that paint kind of saturated in one corner, that part becomes a little bit darker. What I like about how this gouache is drying is that it still gives it a nice flat, even coat. And yeah, for some reason, I kind of really like that. And it's so different from watercolors, but I'm really appreciating that about gouache right now. Who knew that would happen? Yeah, see, look how the paint kind of pools right here in this corner. And so right now, while it's wet, it looks darker in this corner, right? But as it dries, let's see what happens. I'm finding that the gouache actually does dry really quickly, even on this palette. I mean, you know, it has been sitting out here for a while, but yeah, I'm having to work my brush in a little bit more, and that's okay. But I'm just, you know, just observing as I'm doing this exercise. Oh, and I love ultramarine. Just another great color to mix with. Ultramarine is one of those single pigment paints, and so that's really great for mixing, because the more pigments you have in a mixture, you know, the chances that the color might be a little bit muddier than you might anticipate, or it might not be as pure. Now, I don't always look up how many pigments are in my paints, and I'm not that, you know, like picky about it and that specific, but some people are. But yeah, just know that ultramarine deep is a great option for mixing because it has one pigment color. And how you know that is, again, look at the tube label, and it should tell you, you know, how many are in there. So for example, the green should have probably like 2 or 3, because you already had to mix a couple pigments to get there. So this is a permanent green deep, and it has, yeah, it has 3 colors. So it has PY3, PG7, and PB15. So it has a little bit of the, yeah, of all those colors, or all those pigments, I mean. And so when you mix permanent green deep, which has 3 pigments, with another color that may have another 3 pigments, there's just more variables. And so you might not be, yeah, 100% sure of what color you get. All right, on to the last couple colors. Burnt sienna is another color where I'm a little bit indifferent about it. I would actually rather have liked to see burnt umber. I like the darker, deeper, like chocolatey type of color, but I'm not gonna complain. But down the road, I can see myself maybe purchasing a burnt umber tube of paint. Last but not least, let's do the white. I'm really excited about the white because in watercolors we don't ever really use the color white, and that's because when you add white, it really does make the color more muddy. And so instead of using white, we paint around it and allow the white of the paper to shine through. And that's, again, what gives watercolors like its luminosity. Now, craft paper isn't the best paper to be testing watercolors on, but again, this is the only way that it'll get the white to show up. Okay, so that was just a quick test and swatch of the Holbein Gouache set. All right, so next I want to try painting something so I can see how well it layers and just have fun with it. Okay, so one of the first things I thought about painting were like citrus, like lemons and oranges, limes, just because they're easy shapes and you can add colors on top or layer them. So yeah, let me get some of this lemon yellow. And I think I have too much water on my brush. So I'm gonna remove some of it just by blotting. But we'll see how it actually, lays on the paper. Oh yeah, I mean, that's still pretty thick. I really like how those turned out. Yeah, the colors are, so incredibly opaque. Shouldn't blow my mind, but it really is. It's just so different than working with watercolors. So it's taking a little bit of getting used to. So while these lemons and oranges are drying, I'm gonna prep my greenery. And I really like mixing some green and like if I had burnt umber. But because I like this permanent green color, but I don't like how bright green it is. So I am gonna put it right there. But I'm gonna mix just a little bit of burnt sienna in there to kind of warm it up and darken it at the same time. Yeah, I like that color. And I feel like it's a little bit too wet. So what I could do is probably, squeeze some fresh paint right on there or go in there with a drier brush. And let's add some leaves here. Now, if the citrus fruit is already dry, then you can paint right on top. But if it's not, then just be careful. But yeah, that second leaf I just painted, I'm just taking a closer look. Yeah, it's quite opaque. I mean, the paint that I'm using is a little bit more watered down than it should be probably. But for the most part, yeah, it's pretty good. And I think this is where, maybe using some watercolors might be a good advantage because I want, maybe with these greeneries, I don't necessarily have to, layer them right on top of the fruit. And if I am going to, like this one, then maybe that's when I'll use gouache, or maybe I'll add white, to my paint. But so far they're layering pretty well. And because they're so close to watercolors, I'm really liking it. All right, I'm gonna go in there with a smaller brush and I'm gonna add just some like orange details, just some like dots on the lemons. And then I'm going to add yellow dots on the oranges to see how well the yellow comes out. All I'm gonna do is just kind of like dot some here and there. Just give it some personality. Then let's pick up the yellow. This is the lemon yellow, and see how well it comes or layers on top of the orange. Maybe my yellow isn't quite thick enough. I mean, I can see it on my end, but I don't know if it's coming through on the screen. And I kind of want to see what it looks like when I add another kind of like general layer, maybe on this lemon here. I just mixed a little bit of the orange into the lemon yellow. Just want to see how well it sort of layers on top of each other. And again, you want to work with a very dry paint. Yeah, I just want to see how well it kind of, I don't know, lays. I am really liking it. Again, the yellow was really hard to see on the orange, but maybe that was my fault for choosing such a, light but very similar color. So maybe I'll add in some of that flame red into my lemon yellow just to get a darker but toned down orange, and then use that to add some details. Yeah, and obviously that's going to pop because it's a darker color. I do want to see how well maybe the green will pop out on the leaves too. So let me just go in there with some of this permanent green light, and I want to add just a touch of white to it and see how well that lightens up, and then just add some details on these leaves. Well, thanks so much for joining me in this video where we got to test out the Holbein Gouache set. And I hope this gets you excited to kind of try something new, especially if you're a long-time watercolorist. I think gouache is a logical next step to trying something similar, but still very different. So I think the next step from gouache that would be further away from watercolor would be to do the acrylic gouache, which, like I said, I already have a set of, and I'm really excited to test them out. Please like this video if you enjoyed it. Leave a comment below. Maybe you're new to gouache, or maybe you're experienced. I'd love to hear your story. And subscribe to my channel if you want to see more content like this. You can also find me on Instagram and Facebook at AudreyRaDesign and use the hashtag #PaintWithAudrey. I'll see you next time. Bye.